Okay, here's the start button. We are started, and we're going. And I see you there, Eva. Do I see you there? Yes.
There we go.
There you go. There you go.
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to turn off the phone now.
All fixed.
All right, so we're just waiting. I see James has joined us, Mr. Graham. We're doing just a little back and forth here for a minute or so, waiting for our guest to arrive, and then we will begin the show. And let's see if I've got an acknowledgement from Scott. Let's see. I told him it'd be a few minutes. What happens if I click blink? What happens?
Scott just joined us.
There he is. Okay.
Hello.
Let me. Hello, Scott. It's good to hear your voice again.
Scott, it's great to meet you.
Too, Eva.
All right, we'll be going on in 1 minute. We already have an audience of one listening to us, which is great. We're going to get more, I'm sure, as we go along. But let me make sure I've got all my ducks in a row here. And wait till 7, which should be another 30 seconds or so. Call in. Da-da. Okay, good. Looks like everything is in order. The ship hasn't crashed yet. All right, you all set, Eva?
I am all set.
You all set, Scott?
I'm ready.
All right, we'll be bringing you on. We'll do Eva and I will start, and then we'll bring you on as soon as possible.
Sounds good.
All right, welcome to Vamp Chat with Dan and Eva, a podcast devoted to vampire fiction, fanged folklore, and the gothic imagination. I'm Dan Klefstad, author of Fiona's Guardians and its forthcoming sequel.
And I'm Eva Vertrees, author of the Fury Trilogy. Book 1 of Fury is currently out, with Book 2, A Hellish Fury, coming later this year. So, Dan, this is our second episode of Vamp Chat. How does it feel?
Oh, it feels great. You know, after a successful one-off, I can confidently say that after a successful first episode, rather, we are no longer a one-off. We are a series.
Well, our first episode did amazingly well, far beyond our expectations. And I just want to say a quick thank you to all our listeners for making it such a success. This is such a fun podcast to make, and I think it's because it's a topic so near and dear to both of our hearts.
Oh, yeah. That's why we continue to write our own vampire tales and read other books in this genre, both fiction and nonfiction.
Yep, that's right. And speaking of nonfiction, Dan, this episode, it's your turn to lead the fanged folklore part of the show. What will you talk about today?
Oh, Eva, I have been reading about an inherited blood disorder that became known as the vampire disease and helped perpetuate some of the myths and some of the tropes that we associated with the undead or Nosferatu. And I will have more about that after we interview our guest author.
Ooh, I can't wait. How about we bring our guest on the show now? Shall I introduce him?
Oh, yeah, go for it.
I'm so excited because tonight we're delighted to feature Scott Burtness, author of the comedic novel Wisconsin Vamp, Monsters of the Midwest, Book 1. So welcome to the show, Scott.
Thanks, Eva. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great that you're here. And Scott, I just love the premise of Wisconsin Vamp, which kind of reminds me of how Peter Parker became Spider-Man. Only your protagonist, Herb Knudsen, becomes a vampire. Tell us about the insect that is the vector of vampirism in your novel.
So I guess I should first say to your listeners, book's been out for 10 years. There are going to be spoilers. It's your own fault. So
Okay.
So the story kicks off with a mosquito. Mosquito that feeds on a vampire far, far away, and through a series of mishaps ends up in rural northeastern Wisconsin. And that mosquito ends up in Herb Knudsen's coffee, and he drinks it.
I want to say that this method of becoming a vampire was so unique and well done that I was literally laughing as I read it. I mean, it absolutely thrilled me. And what was great about it is you captured both the bite, because the mosquito bites him, and the drinking of the blood, which it was
Hmm.
weird. It was when he literally falls into his coffee and then he drinks it. So you captured both the bite and the drinking of the blood, which is the traditional way of becoming a vampire, but you did it in such a unique way. So where did you get the idea for this undead mosquito, which was brilliant?
Yeah, I mean, I think, first and foremost, I really wanted to write about the vampire that wasn't fulfilling a dark prophecy, the vampire that wasn't what you typically see in London or New Orleans or Los Angeles. I wanted to write about the other guy, and it was important to me to try and find a way to have him become a vampire without knowing what had happened to him. I wanted that to be kind of his journey of self discovery. Uh, so, somewhere around when I was starting to kick around this idea for a story, there was a Russian fantasy sci-fi movie called Night Watch. Was that the first one, or was it Day Watch?
Yeah, I know what you're talking about, and I get
Yeah,
them confused too. Yeah. Mhm.
great movie, regardless of the name. But in this world, there's this idea or this concept of the gloom. It's this sort of shallow, shadowy, like reality right next door that these supernatural creatures can move through. And the gloom was full of mosquitoes. And I remember, I remember seeing that and thinking that makes sense because those little bloodsuckers are not of this world. Um, and then from there, it really just took root. I mean, Wisconsin's full of mosquitoes.
And it's
Um,
the state
It
bird,
is.
isn't it?
it's pretty much our state bird, yeah. So it just fit, and it gave me a really fun way to uh, start a sequence of events with a lot of mystery for our poor protagonist, and have some fun doing it.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Now, one fun fact: my mother's side of the family is actually from Wisconsin. And I was also laughing as I read, because I was transported to Summers with my Aunt Fern and Uncle Everett in Birchwood, Wisconsin, which is actually between Hayward and Rice Lake, so the upper northwestern portion. And they had a resort on Lake Chautauqua, and you captured so many nuances that only someone from there would fully understand. The way that they talked and some of the little, just the little things. And I think your choice of location was awesome. But I'd like to know why you chose to set the book in Wisconsin. Is it because you're from there, or was it, some catalyst like, you know what, I think I'm gonna have this guy be from here?
So usually the first answer I give is because everything weird happens in Wisconsin. Um, but yeah, the funny truth is that I'm actually a Minnesotan, uh,
Okay.
and I'm a Wisconsin resident now, but back then I was a Minnesotan. When I was a kid, my best friend's dad lived in small town western Wisconsin, and so I spent countless summers out in Grantsburg, just chasing wood ticks in the woods and shooting pop cans and eating cheese curds and all the things.
A lot like
And
me.
yeah, and I've always really had just the best memories of Grantsburg and that time. Um, Again, when thinking about the story, like when you want to tell that other guy becoming a vampire, what's his story? What I really like about just like small town Wisconsin, small town USA is how sometimes the smallest things have big significance. And
Huh.
so, you put somebody in, again, like London or New York City or Atlanta, and something truly big has to happen to be noticed because you're in this just massive world. You put somebody in a small little town, population 500, and the annual bowling tournament is a big deal. Whether or not the truck stop actually has a good Reuben is a big deal. And and so I love the idea of like the things that are so important, the things that are really big stakes for these characters are really relatable. Again, we're not trying to save the world here. We're just trying to, see if we can get a date with the waitress that we have a crush on.
Yeah.
Um, And so it really started to fit. I like the idea of writing just relatable characters in familiar settings, where their world and the things that they're trying to accomplish are things that pretty much everybody can understand.
And these are really important decisions you're making early on in the book. A big city versus what can how something can affect a small town.
Mhm.
And another decision that I'm sure you had to make early on as a writer was: is this going to be a straight up horror novel, or is it going to be a comedy? And you went for funny. Well, what made you
Yeah.
choose this route for your book?
Yeah, I mean, I've always liked horror comedy. I've always liked comedy. I mean, I was raised on Monty Python and Douglas Adams and Terry Pratchett and Red Dwarf and Faulty Towers and all those things. Um, I got
That's
into
my childhood
college.
too.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very kind of Gen X upbringing, but I think what really hooked me on horror comedy was when I first saw Evil Dead, and then I
Yeah.
saw Evil Dead. And what struck me was, that the first one, it was almost like they tried to make a scary movie, but it ended up being funny. And so they went back and did it again, and they made it funny, and it worked. And I've loved that ever since. Whether it was Buffy the Vampire Slayer or Shaun of the Dead, reading authors like Christopher Moore, uh, Christopher Moore's Bite Me, a love story. I really like this idea of any moment that you find in horror, any moment, the call is coming from inside the house, there's just one step away, a slightly different perspective that's hilarious. The call's coming from inside the house and the phone just died, and now the killer is trying to find a working phone so he can call back. Like there's all those moments that that's what I like to write. It's just that look at something that could be scary, could be terrifying, could be really tense, and just finding that little mustard stain that makes it all different.
So Wisconsin.
Well, and to that end, you have a unique way of describing people and places. And there's one section that, if you'll allow me to read it, that had me as a fellow author. Honestly, I was somewhat jealous, and I'm just going to read it real quick. Something about bowling alleys, thought Herb. There was definitely something magical about the simple ritual of having a beer and a game of bowling that brought out the best in people. His gait slowed as he took it all in. Over there was Marge Henderson, the dandruff on her bowling jersey sparkling in the track lighting. And there, Fancy Dan, whose artful blend of polyester and pleather threw mismatched patterns and eye-searing colors at anyone foolish enough to look. Slow Johnson moved with measured gait, a regal dance across a ballroom all his own. The people Herb had seen for years were suddenly vivid, new, moving in perfect arrangement against a backdrop of wood paneling. Bathed in neon beer sign light, they appeared infused with all the colors of the rainbow. When you I got to know, when you walk into places, cuz as an author, I like to take in details, because I like, I'll go into a situation, I'm like, "Ooh, I this would be a great scene. I need to remember this, in my head." And so when you walk into places, do you just naturally notice details like this?
I mean, I like to look for I like to look for the things that aren't, I don't know, the things that are a little bit. I'm trying to think of what you're talking about. My writing, my speaking is now apparently gone out the window. Um, like I do like the details that strike a chord, or like create an image in an unexpected way. And the lighting and the paneling and the carpet patterns in every bowling alley built from the 60s through the 80s in America, I mean, it's just epic. And and so here you have this person who, like, all of a sudden is experiencing the world in a new and deeper way. And what are they going to see? What are they going to smell? What are they going to feel? And yeah, dandruff on a black polyester bowling jersey, lit from from above, is it's something that you might look past 100 times, and all of a sudden you're seeing that world in a new way, and it's a detail that just captures you. And so those are the things that I tried to find in my world building, was like, what are the small things that you might have looked at 100 times, and it's the next time when all of a sudden you notice it, and it helps really establish that place. It makes it special.
And I think that's something important for all the younger or writers in our audience, or people who are maybe just beginning their writing careers. Details like that can matter, and especially when you've got a freshly created vampire who's noticing the world in a completely new way. I thought that was just a masterstroke what you did there in that passage.
And it kind of goes back to the idea of, any moment in any book or story or film or whatnot, there's a different perspective. And for somebody writing, like a classic gothic horror novel, they're going to find details in their world that are going to amplify that and draw you in that direction. Or if somebody's writing splatterpunk, they're going to find details. And for me, writing comedy, it's like, yep, there's that good old fashioned Budweiser beer chandelier with the horses going round and round.
Which we've all seen at one point or another.
I noticed that too and laughed. Yeah.
Now, Scott, one of the things I look for when reading a vampire novel is which tropes the author keeps in their story and which ones they change. And an important trope involves transformation. And usually, in most stories, the vampire's victim dies, is buried, and then rises as a vampire the next night. In your book, Herb transforms slowly, as if he's contracted an illness. We see him stare several times into a mirror, and his reflection starts fading. Sometimes it glitches and then it fades. What gave you the idea to make Herb's transition gradual?
Yeah. So I gotta confess, I'm not an avid student of vampire lore. I am a consumer of pop culture.
Okay.
And when I started thinking about, this transformation, um, I started looking at the things that I was watching at the time. So the Blade movies were really popular with Wesley
Oh,
Snipes.
yes. I love
Um,
those.
and that there's much like with zombies, there's this idea of, is this truly a supernatural condition, or is there a biological aspect to it? And I like the idea of the vampire being a little more on that biological side, that
Hmm.
this was transmitted through a vector, and it is now having an impact. And it was a very teeny tiny amount of blood. I mean, how much can a mosquito really hold?
Right. Yeah.
So it was going to take some time for it to actually start to have an impact on him. Um, so that's why I just, part of it was just I guess, like when you start talking about like magic systems in your world, and is it soft or hard, and what are all the rules and everything else. Like I like the idea of it being more biological than strictly supernatural. And that worked well for the story that I wanted to tell. I wanted to have this journey of self discovery, this, becoming more than he had been before, but also having a whole host of problems chasing along right behind him while he was doing it.
Well, here's an example of that actually that I'm looking at right now on page 80 to the beginning of page 81, where he's discovering his powers, but the acquisition or his mastery of these powers is a little bit uneven, and
Mhm.
so he's learning to fly. He already attempts to do that.
Attempts
Uh,
to, yeah.
yeah, and the paragraph here that I'll read is when he belly flopped on the ground about 2 seconds later, it knocked all the air out of his lungs, and Herb felt both heard and felt at least two ribs crack. His teeth bit down when his chin was jammed up, impaling his tongue with one of his new sharp incisors and dislocating his jaw. Judging from the lacing pain in his hip, Herb was pretty sure he'd cracked his pelvis too. Immobilized by the pain, Herb lay face down in the grass. A single bloody tear welled up in his eye, rolled sideways down to drip into the grassy dirt pressed into his cheek. Fangs? Yup. No reflection in mirrors? True. Ugly? Not yet. Kung fu? Sorta. Fly? Not so much. I just love that.
Thanks. Yeah, that was, I mean, for me, it was fun playing with what tropes I wanted to bring in. So I mentioned Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and I love this idea of like when someone turns into a vamp, they spring up from the earth, they are ugly as sin, and they know kung fu. Like,
Yeah, right.
where did that come from? And so, when you've got some poor guy in rural Wisconsin, circa, we'll call it 2005, and you're looking for knowledge, you're looking for inspiration, and all you have is the VHS tapes at the local convenience store. Like that's where he's learning from, and he's like, okay, this is what I'm seeing. Is this true for me? Yeah, kind of. Nope, definitely not. And so that was the fun of it for me, was actually thinking about some of those popular modern tropes and just going through that process of elimination of which ones Herb would be allowed to have and which ones he just wasn't going to get.
Well, I love how he's having to learn his abilities and drawbacks on his own. Like what got me was when he has to take his drunken buddies home. So he's got one passed out on his shoulder, and of course the other one's passed out in the yard. The one that actually has the apartment, or the Rambler. And he's got one guy on his shoulder, and he can't go in because he hasn't been given permission. So he's stone cold sober, and he's having to take his two drunk buddies home. He's got one slinged over his shoulder, and he can't get in. And it was so funny because you take the little things about being a vampire and you put Herb in these hilarious situations to figure them out. And again, like you said, all he's got is for reference or movies. And finally the one guy passed out comes to, and he's like, "Go on in and get a beer." And that was enough permission to allow him to get the drunken buddy off his shoulder onto the couch. I mean, it was great. And how many of us have taken our drunken buddies home? And it was just priceless. I loved it.
Oh, thanks.
If you are just joining us, we're talking with Scott Burtness, author of Wisconsin Vamp. Scott, stay with us while we tease what's coming up in the final segment of Vamp Chat. This is where we'll review a film or TV series. And Eva, tonight you're reviewing a somewhat obscure series that originated a tad north of Wisconsin.
Exactly. So tonight I'll review one of my favorite vampire series. It's Canadian, and about a homicide detective who only works at the night shift because, you guessed it, he's a vampire.
Now, Eva, I've seen a few episodes and I'm looking forward to your review. Scott, we should mention that Wisconsin Vamp is the first of a series called Monsters of the Midwest, and we see other characters in book one turn into different monsters for the following two books. I'd like you to just give us a thumbnail description of the remaining books in the series.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you've got three friends in Wisconsin. Herb is your lovable loser. Dallas is your egotistical ladies' man. And Stanley thinks he got abducted by aliens back in high school. So these three friends are in all the books, but book two picks up where book one left off, but it's now Dallas's turn. He's going to get a little sympathy for the devil as he becomes a werewolf. And then the trilogy rounds out with book three, with Stanley, poor Stanley, becoming a zombie and starting a zombie apocalypse in town, but also having to stop that zombie apocalypse somehow, some way. So just a fun way to tell the story, where instead of one main character all the way through, I've got my three guys, and the perspective just shifts with each novel in the trilogy.
Very
I love
cool.
it. So, Scott, you have three books as part of the series. So what's next for you? I mean, what are you writing now?
Have you ever heard the expression, "You never stop clapping, the time between claps just gets longer"? So,
I have not heard that. I
felt that. I felt that, but
yeah, it's like a shower thought. So after Wisconsin Vamp, I took a few years off. I came back and wrote a comedic urban fantasy trilogy that I wrapped up last year, and now I'm back into one of my lulls. It might be a year, it might be five, before the muse strikes again. So at present, I'm not actually actively writing. I'm just enjoying reading and skydiving and all the fun things life has to offer.
call it research for your next book.
Call it
Yeah,
research. Yep.
exactly. It's a skydiving Bigfoot or something.
Yes. Okay, Eva, I'm taking that. I'm running with it.
Hey, it's Wisconsin. Everything, you never know.
That's right. All
I
right.
need a bigger parachute.
Good one. Okay, Scott. Now, during Vamp Chat, we ask each of our guests the same questions at the end of the interview. Eva, would you like to begin?
Sure. So, Scott, who is your favorite vampire of all time and why?
Vampire Hunter D. from the anime series.
Ah,
Yeah,
Oh,
he
that's
nice.
he is
cool.
he is just cool. I mean, he is like the Clint Eastwood of vampire cool. And I saw one of the Vampire in a D animes at a formative point in my life, and have just thought of him as the coolest vampire ever since.
Go ahead, make my
Mm.
day. Yeah, right. So, what vampire power do you wish you had?
So in Wisconsin Vamp, I call it the whammy. Um, that
Hmm.
idea that the vampire can ensorcel you or entrance you. Um, would love to be able to do that because I'm terrible at winning arguments. It would be really handy if I could just gaze into their eyes and convince them that I'm actually right.
That's awesome.
Fantastic. Yeah.
So, are you Team Louis or Team Lestat?
Oh, wow. Wow. Uh, you know what? I'm not going to say Lestat because I don't want to get sued by Tom Cruise. I've heard that he just will go after
He's
anybody.
very sensitive. Yes.
Yeah, he's very sensitive. No, I'm Team Louis. I think what's interesting is the idea of if someone dies and comes back to life, do they have a soul? Do they have morals? And I really like the idea of Louis as someone that's trying to hold on to that idea of right and wrong through this completely world changing transformation. So Team Louis.
All right, there you go. There you go, Dan. You've got one, and
Yep,
I've
we
got
have something in
nothing.
common. Yes.
You okay? We're gonna keep score. You've got one, Dan. I've got nothing right now. Okay,
Okay.
it's 1-0.
And here's the final question, Scott. Would you want to be turned into a vampire? And if so, why?
No, because I really love sunsets, and I
Mm.
would hate to never see one ever again.
That's a great answer. That's a great
That's
answer.
I actually teared up hearing that. That's oh.
Well, Scott, we want to thank you for coming onto the show. I mean, it honestly has been wonderful reading Wisconsin Vamp and getting to know you. So where can listeners find your books? Let's give you a little self promotion here.
Yeah, I mean, the one and only place is Amazon. They're available in ebook, paperback, audiobook, but I'm a single platform guy. So if you're looking up on Amazon, everything's there.
All right. Nice and simple. One-stop shopping for all your vampire needs. Well, thank you so much, Scott. And of course, you're welcome to hang out and listen to the rest of the show if you like, or if you're getting thirsty and you need a beer, you can do that too. We won't stop you. Put a dent in your Wisconsin lifestyle. So, however you want to spend the rest of your evening, thank you for joining us. We really appreciate
Yes,
it, man.
thank you so much.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Eva. This was great.
Okay.
All right. Well, we've arrived at the part of our show where we discuss a nonfiction aspect of vampires. So now we all know vampires are real, but some people think they are mythical creatures that came into our imagination because of some scientific catalyst that allowed the legend to develop. So what have you got for us, Dan?
Well, Eva, I would like to talk about a medical fact that helped spread the notion that vampires might be living among us. And that fact is a disease called porphyria. It has been with us. Perhaps you've heard of porphyria.
No, I haven't. Maybe I have,
Okay.
maybe I've heard of the symptoms, but not actually known what it was called.
Ooh, I have a student now. I can teach somebody about porphyria. It's a disease that's been with us for millennia, and it became prevalent among the nobility and royalty of Eastern Europe. You guessed it, through inbreeding. So, what is porphyria? It is an inherited blood disorder that causes the body to produce less heme, which is a critical component of hemoglobin, that protein in red blood cells that carries oxygen from the lungs to the rest of the body.
Okay.
So one of the symptoms is episodic madness. But for this podcast, I was interested in the symptoms that caused porphyria to become known as the vampire disease. And would you like to know these symptoms?
I actually would, yes.
Okay. They'll all make sense
Okay.
when we dive into them. Extreme sensitivity to sunlight.
Okay. Check that box.
Yeah, absolutely. Patients with porphyria actually feel pain when exposed to the sun. What's more, extended exposure can cause facial disfigurement, blackened skin, and hair growth. These things here, it may also be the origin of that trope that vampires have an aversion to mirrors, just because they can actually see what they look like after being exposed to the sun, I guess,
Yeah.
which is really kind of fascinating when you think about it.
Okay.
Uh,
Check.
the next one,
Check that box.
check that box. Okay. The next one is fangs.
Oh,
So, repeated attacks of this disease can cause the gums to recede, exposing more of the teeth, which then look like fangs.
okay. Check that box.
Check that one. All right. Okay.
Yep.
One more. Actually, there are a couple more. Blood drinking. So I got to be a little bit clear here. The urine of porphyria patients is typically dark red. And because of this, folk tales have long taken it as a given that these people must have been drinking blood. In fact, some physicians used to recommend that these patients drink blood to compensate for the defect in their red blood cells. But
Okay.
this recommendation was for animal blood. Okay, so yeah, just to be clear, there's nobody saying you need to go kill a human and drink their blood. Nevertheless, when these,
That actually makes sense. That kind of makes sense. Okay, I get it. Drink
yeah,
blood because your heme is low. Okay, I can go with that. Yeah.
yeah, so cow blood, whatever. Nevertheless, when these people went out at night, which I guess is the only time they felt safe enough to leave the house, they were suspected of seeking human blood, and their fangs have only ever amplified that notion. So these people who suffered from porphyria, and there are many different varieties of porphyria, were often isolated and marginalized, and even put in danger. So there's another one that will, I think, interest you. An aversion to garlic. So the sulfur content of garlic could lead to an attack of porphyria, leading to acute pain. Thus, this plays in with the vampire's aversion to garlic. Now, Eva, I've got one for you that isn't a symptom, but
Okay.
maybe best understood as a trauma response.
Okay.
Fear of the crucifix. So let me explain. During the Spanish Inquisition, which began in the 15th century, about 600 so-called vampires were reportedly burned at the stake. I didn't know this until I started doing research about this. Now, almost certainly, many of these accused were innocent sufferers of porphyria. So, as a result, porphyria patients probably have some reason to fear Christian symbols. Now, today, of course, we have much more scientific knowledge, but the disorder remains incurable after all these hundreds of years. The only treatment is supportive, so pain control, fluids, and the avoidance of drugs or chemicals that provoke acute attacks. However, researchers say some success has been achieved with stem cell transplants, but again, we have no news of a cure. So, as a result, sufferers of this ancient blood disorder must continue to avoid sunlight, garlic, and I suppose the inherited PTSD that crucifixes bring.
That is really interesting because I'm sitting here thinking, I'm like, so did it say how prevalent this was? I know it was a nobility because of inbreeding, but how prevalent was this?
Well, I'm going to use deductive reasoning here and hypothesize, is that the right word?
Yeah.
That isolated communities that inbred or where inbreeding occurred were much more likely to have cases, have children who would then present symptoms of porphyria.
Did it say when it would come on, like what age, or was it from birth, or did it just pop in like when they became teenagers or young adults, or?
I saw nothing specific about the age of when the symptoms would appear, but yeah, I can go back and look at that. That might be kind of interesting. So, I also want to say, during my research, I encountered a list of people, famous people, who had or are suspected of having porphyria. Would you
Oh,
like to know who they are?
yeah, I would.
Now, you probably have heard of a film called The Madness of King George.
Yes.
Okay, in which George III, who lost the American colonies, had porphyria. The film borrows historical references to the king's water or his urine, which appeared reddish or even reddish blue. Now, not surprisingly, George George had at least one ancestor, Mary, Queen of Scots, who was also suspected of having the disease. And then we get the descendants of George III suspected of having it. There were two suspects, and then a third, Prince William of Gloucester, was diagnosed with a version called variegate porphyria. Now, it is with a grain of salt that I had to take this one. Another famous person thought to have porphyria was, wait for it, Vlad the Impaler, or Vlad Dracula III. He was known to, I guess, to have an aversion to sunlight, and so that's why some folks said, he must have had a version of porphyria. But he was also suspected of having hemolacria, a disorder that presents as bloody tears. So there's just a little extra there for that. But the most famous person thought to have the disorder is Vincent van Gogh, who some experts believe had a version called acute intermittent porphyria. And of course, he had the madness as well, which is a characteristic of this disease. But even this disease goes way back. It's even referenced in the Old Testament. The 4th chapter of the book of Daniel refers to King Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylon as displaying symptoms that we now know as porphyria. And I got to say, speaking as an author, I am definitely interested in learning more about this disorder and maybe adding it to my future tales involving the undead.
I'm sitting here thinking the exact same thing because,
Oh, yeah.
you know, in my head, I'm thinking, well, what if this wasn't porphyria? What if they in fact were vampires, you know, and this was just a way to either mask it or, you know, all kinds of things are going through my head as an author because, you know, you could just, there's so much you can play with there.
Yeah, there is a lot of room to explore, and I'm kind of excited to see what. Well, first of all, what the hell am I going to do? Doing it, but also, what's Eva how's she gonna use this? This ought to be really interesting.
This is a great playground. Scott, what do you think about it? Is he still on?
I'm still here.
I think Scott might have.
Oh yeah.
Well, what do you think?
So honestly,
Yeah.
I told you I was taking a break. Now I'm apparently not taking a break. I've got to write about porphyria and vampires and everything else. No, I personally, you know, I love the idea of, you know, how do vampires exist in our society, and you know, try to assuage concerns or superstitions about them. You know, deflect, but also, you know, how does society understand something so completely ununderstandable? So I love the idea of a story where, you know, porphyria is the supposed explanation, but you start to peel back the onion and you realize that there's more going on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We may have to get together and share ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yes. Let's form a club called the Porphyria Club. Maybe we'll start a podcast.
I love that. I love this. I love this, Dan. This is really, really interesting. I
Yeah.
honestly, I've heard of, you know, malnutrition causing the gums to recede and things like that. But I honestly had not heard of porphyria. I'm really
Yeah.
surprised that I hadn't, but that is really neat.
Yeah, I
And-
thought so.
and
I
then it
thought
goes
you'd
back-
like it.
Yeah, and then it goes back so far. I mean, that's so much to work with as an author.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So we should probably tease the next show, which I understand is September 18th. Tell us a little bit about what's going to be happening in that show, Eva.
So we are actually going to feature Gary Hill, who is an editor and contributor to the anthology Lifeblood 2.
I can't wait to. I know Gary. He lives in Rockford, or the Rockford, Illinois area, and he's an interesting guy. He's been around. He writes a lot of horror, and it'll be fun to talk with him. Okay, now this is the point of the show where we reveal what vampire video content we've been consuming. And tonight, Eva will review an obscure TV series from north of the border.
You know, everything's in the north today. So what I'm going to review is the Canadian television series that ran from May 1992 to May 1996 called Forever Knight, and that's Knight. So the main character is Nick Knight, and he's played by Geraint Wyn Davies. He's a Welsh actor. He was in Cube 2, Hypercube, Murdoch Mysteries, the Scottish play. So Nick is an 800-year-old vampire working as a homicide detective in the graveyard shift in modern-day Toronto. So this takes place actually in Canada. And let's see, he has a partner. His partner is Detective Don Skanky, played by John Kapelos. And he's been in The Shape of Water, The Umbrella Academy, and scores of other movies, including like The Breakfast Club. And the two of them have a really interesting relationship, with Skanky being that very New York type detective, always eating, quick to jump into action, and Nick being that cool-headed thinker. So
Because he's a vampire.
because he's a vampire, yes. So, one advantage of being a vampire working on the police force at night is the ability for Nick to use his superhuman characteristics, including enhanced senses, mind control, and to help bring these criminals to justice. And what I love is he even drives a 1962 Cadillac because he says it has the largest amount of trunk space. And this, of course, is, should it get stuck at daybreak, he just
Oh,
hop in the trunk.
have a place to sleep. Oh my God, that's great.
So, most of his colleagues are unaware of Nick's true identity as a vampire. And only his friend, who's the city medical examiner, played by Natalie Lambert. She's played by Catherine Drescher, who was in The Good Witch, Resident Evil. And for those fellow geeks out there, she's also the voice of Jean Grey on the animated series X-Men. Only she knows about Nick's true identity. And at the beginning of the series, she's known this for a while, and she's trying to help him the entire series become human again. So she's convinced that, Scott, like you said, it's a virus, it's something, and he can become human again. So and of course he wants to do this because he feels guilty for centuries of killing others and seeks redemption for his acts as a vampire. And his quest for redemption becomes even more complicated when fellow vampires arrive in Toronto and throw obstacles in front of him. So his maker, Lucien Lacroix, played by Nigel Bennett, who's a very accomplished actor, discovered Nick when he was Nicholas de Brabant, a knight returning home from the Crusades. And he's constantly trying to turn Nick toward the vampire lifestyle he approves of. And then in Toronto, he's the host of a nighttime radio show, which I absolutely love, called The Nightcrawler. He calls himself The Nightcrawler, and he comes
That's
on
great.
nighttime television show or radio show. And then the other prominent vampire in Nick's life is Jeanette Ducharme, who was with Lacroix when Nick was turned, and now runs a nightclub called The Raven. So there's a lot of kind of clichéic things here, but it's layered. It's a layering of nightly cases to solve, the ongoing backstories of the vampires interfering with Nick's life, his need to regain his humanity, and what would be a good vampire show without the sexual tension and longing between Nick and Natalie. I mean, come on, it's got everything wrapped into one. So,
Can I just interject here?
Sure.
I know another show that I've seen, a Canadian show that starred, or that had starred Geraint Wyn Davies, the Nick Knight, the vampire cop or detective. And that's season 2 of Slings and Arrows, which is about a Shakespeare company in Toronto, which is basically really, the Stratford Festival. And so he plays a legendary actor who's hired to play Macbeth in Slings and Arrows season 2. And he is great in the role. He's just really incredible to watch in that series. And I recognized him right away in the first episode of Forever Night.
Yeah, he's one of those actors that he's in these little things, and he's also a Shakespearean actor. So he's been on some plays and stuff, and it's like, oh, I know him from somewhere. And the whole cast is like that. It's like, oh, I know her, and I know him, and I've seen him. And I loved it because Geraint, in an Entertainment Tonight interview in 1995, I love this quote. He said, "The biggest chunk of foreplay you're ever going to get is eternity."
Well, that's another exciting way to think about eternity, isn't it? Yes. Okay.
But another cool thing about the show is his musical talent was brought to prominence on the show when he actually played the piano in the loft and co-wrote a song for the Baby Baby episode. And as a result, he was featured in one of the selections on the first Forever Night CD. He's a self-taught musician, and he's produced a CD on his own called Bar Talk, which is sold through his fan club. But the proceeds go to a variety of charities, such as the Children's Hospital Foundation in Washington, D.C., and the Stratford Festival's Shakespeare School in Stratford, Ontario. So
Very cool.
really, really neat show.
Well, last week, Eva, we introduced a number system to rate these shows or movies, and that's drops of blood, with 10 being the highest. How many drops of blood will you give Forever Night?
Okay, so gotta be honest, this series on DVD is sold as a trilogy, and it took me a while to find the third collection. So I had the first two, and I needed that third, and I didn't just order it online. So I actually love hunting for things in places like, Half Price Books and small locally owned book and movie stores. So when I got it, I was so excited, and I couldn't wait to see how everything ended. So unfortunately, and I don't want to give away the ending, so I need to be careful here, the last few episodes didn't give me that satisfied ending I was hoping for. I don't know if it was waning in the ratings or if contracts were coming due, as many shows do when faced with situations like that, but it felt rushed, and the ending just wasn't that put together, and it wasn't the ending that most of us want. So now the rest of the shows are awesome, and it definitely worth watching, and they're in that early cheesy late 80s early 90s style.
Yeah.
For this reason, I'm going to give it a solid 7 drops of blood. I really wanted, I hate to say that the last few episodes kind of killed it for me, but I'd spent all this time watching it, and it was like, oh. So I'm going to give it 7 drops of blood.
Well, but for closure, it could have had a much higher rating, is what it sounds like you're saying.
Exactly. But well worth watching. It's just a neat show.
I've seen the first 2 episodes, and I'm looking forward to seeing a third tonight, actually, later on. So I'm going to stick with it for a while, because I like Garrett Wynn Davies, and I'm also thinking about what I'm going to review during the next show, which is September 18th, and I think I'm very close to deciding. Maybe I'll do a little social media on that one later, in the week. But that is our show. Be sure to listen to our next episode of Vamp Chat with Dan and Eva on September 18th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, when we talk with Gary Hill, editor of and a contributor to the anthology Lifeblood 2.
And thanks to this evening's guest, Scott Burtness. Thank you so much, and sharing your novel with us, Wisconsin Vamp.
And thanks to you for listening to the show. Be sure to follow us on Facebook and Instagram. You can also email us at vampchatwithdanandeva@gmail.com.
All right, children of the night, we wish you safe dreams.
Just keep an eye open for those creatures of the night.
And if you can't sleep, we have books to recommend. Be sure to sink your teeth into Dan's novel, Fiona's Guardians.
Or this might be a perfect night to devour Eva's novel, A Fury.
Shall we do it on 3?
All right. Yeah, actually, I think the last night we were testing this, sort of in rehearsal, and we kind of came up with a new way to say goodnight to our lovely listeners. Go ahead.
I will say that, and with that,
we bid you good night.
Thank you, Scott.
Thanks so much, Scott.
Guys.
Thanks to everybody who listened.
That was great.
Okay. All right.
Goodbye.